The call came at 2:14 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I've trained myself to note it automatically. 31 years on the force will do that to a man. The phone buzzed against my nightstand and I was already reaching for it before the second vibration. That particular reflex that never fully leaves you no matter how many years you've been retired. The number was from Mercy General, Nashville, Tennessee. My chest tightened the way it does when your body understands something before your mind does. Uncle Raymond? The woman's voice was young, slightly breathless. This is Mercy General calling. Your nephew was brought in by ambulance about 40 minutes ago. He's in serious condition. They're asking family to come in immediately. What happened? I was already sitting up, feet on the floor, head-on collision on Route 109. He's in critical care. Please come as soon as you can. The line went quiet before I could ask anything else. I sat there for a moment in the dark. In the house my wife Margaret and I had shared for 28 years before cancer took her, thinking about my nephew Daniel, 29 years old, the only child of my brother Frank, who died of a heart attack 4 years back, leaving Daniel with nothing but debt and a chip on his shoulder the size of the Cumberland Plateau. I'd taken him in 8 months ago when he showed up at my door with Kayla, his fiancée, and 2 duffel bags, and a story about a landlord who'd changed the locks without notice. I dressed quickly, grabbed my keys. Outside, November had settled its full weight on Nashville. The roads were empty and slick. I drove the way I used to drive when dispatch called a serious incident, focused and steady, keeping the panic in a separate compartment the way you learn to do after enough years of seeing what panic costs people. Mercy General materialized through the streetlights, its emergency entrance throwing red and white light across the wet pavement. I parked and crossed the lot at a fast walk. The automatic doors opened and the familiar smell of hospitals hit me, antiseptic and something underneath it. Grief, maybe. Hospitals always smelled like grief to me. The registration desk was staffed by a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair. I gave her Daniel's name, and she began clicking through her system. Her brow furrowed almost immediately. She clicked again, then looked up at me with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone about to deliver confusing news. Sir, I'm showing no admission under that name tonight. No trauma cases matching that description in the last 2 hours. I leaned forward. Check again. I got a call from this hospital. Critical care. She made 3 calls. Emergency. Trauma. The ICU. I stood at that counter and watched her work through each one carefully, and with every call my mind was doing what 31 years as a police officer had trained it to do. Assembling details. The voice on the phone had been slightly too smooth. The timing of the call. Well past 2 in the morning, when a man is at his most disoriented. The way she'd hung up before I could ask follow-up questions. Sir, she set down the phone and looked at me steadily. There is no Daniel Marsh in this hospital tonight. I'm very sorry. I thanked her, told her she'd been helpful. Then I turned toward the exit and stood still for a moment in the fluorescent glare, running the thing back through my mind the way I used to run crime scenes. That's when I felt a hand close around my wrist. I turned. A woman in scrubs was standing just inside a doorway to my left. 50s, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that were completely alert for that hour of the night. Her name tag read Beverly Okafor, RN. She glanced past me toward the registration desk, then pulled me gently but firmly through the door she'd come from and into a narrow corridor that smelled of linen carts and floor wax. I know why you're here, she said, her voice low and precise. Your nephew isn't injured. He was never in an accident. Don't sign anything tonight. Trust me and listen. What are you? She held up one hand. About an hour ago, a young woman came in through the employee entrance. She knows one of the orderlies on this floor. I overheard them talking in the break room. She was using his access code to print official-looking hospital letterhead. She wanted to know if anyone would notice documents backdated to tonight's date. She mentioned a name, Raymond Marsh. She said, the old man will come running the minute he thinks Danny is hurt. Then she said, all he has to do is sign, and we handle the rest in the morning. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere distant, a monitor beeped its patient rhythm. I need you to tell me everything you heard, I said. She did. Standing in that narrow service corridor at 2:30 in the morning, Beverly Okafor, a nurse I'd never met before that night, described what she'd overheard with the kind of precise, ordered recollection that makes a good witness. The young woman had been talking to the orderly about a power of attorney document, about getting an elderly relative to sign while emotionally distressed, about a window of opportunity that only existed if everything moved fast. I pulled out my phone and asked if she'd be willing to put that in writing, to give me her contact information, to testify if it came to that. She didn't hesitate. I drove home through the empty streets of Nashville, watching the wet asphalt catch my headlights. The rage was there, underneath the surface, the way it always was when I saw predators at work. But 31 years had taught me something more valuable than rage. It had taught me patience. Controlled, deliberate, devastating patience. Daniel and Kayla would be asleep in my guest room when I got home. They'd be expecting me to come through that door shaken, off balance. A 64-year-old widower who'd just been frightened out of his sleep by the threat of losing his only remaining family. They'd be expecting me to be vulnerable. They had no idea what they'd just started. I sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside, and let the full picture come together. 8 months of small things that had seemed like ordinary friction now rearranged themselves into a pattern I recognized from case files. The way Kayla went through my mail without asking, and called it helping. The way Daniel had started accompanying me to the bank, hanging back just far enough to seem casual. The questions about the house. How much was it worth? Had I ever thought about downsizing? Wasn't it a lot to maintain for one person? And the money. $4,000 in March for a truck payment they swore they'd make good on. $2,200 in June for Kayla's medical bills that somehow never produced an invoice. $1,800 2 months ago for something Daniel described as a licensing fee for a business I'd never seen any evidence of. I'd given them those things because Frank was gone and Daniel was Frank's son, and blood is supposed to mean something. I'd believed that. I'd wanted to believe it. I went inside. The house was dark and quiet. I could hear Daniel snoring faintly through the guest room wall. I went to my study, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and didn't touch it. Just sat there in the dark and started planning. Over the following 2 days, I maintained my performance. I came downstairs looking tired, which wasn't hard. I moved slowly through the kitchen. When Kayla asked if something was wrong, I told her I hadn't slept well. She made sympathetic sounds. Daniel patted my shoulder and suggested I see a doctor about the insomnia. The concern in both their faces was very well executed. On the 3rd morning, I drove across town to an attorney named Grace Whitfield, a woman I'd worked with on a civil fraud case years ago. Her office was in a brick building on Charlotte Avenue, practical and unadorned, the kind of space that belongs to someone who spends her time working rather than impressing. I laid out everything I knew. Beverly's account, the financial history, the pattern of access and grooming. Grace listened without interrupting, took notes in a precise hand, and when I finished, she looked at me with an expression that was professional and serious. "This is elder financial abuse," she said, "potentially attempted fraud, and the power of attorney attempt, if we can document it, is a felony." She paused. "What do you want?" "I want to protect everything I've built, and then I want them to face every consequence the law provides." She nodded once. We revised my will that same afternoon. The house, which I'd bought with Margaret in 1989 and paid off 10 years later, went to a Veterans Assistance Fund that helped law enforcement families in financial crisis. Daniel's name was removed entirely. He had been listed as the primary beneficiary. He was not listed anywhere in the new document. I signed it, had it witnessed, and Grace filed it with the county recorder before close of business. From her office, I drove to a branch of my bank on the west side of town, one where the branch manager didn't know my face. I explained that I wanted to open a new savings account and transfer a substantial amount from my primary account. She processed the transfer without comment. My primary account now reflected roughly $60,000, real enough to appear accessible, far below my actual worth. Anyone checking that account would see a figure consistent with a fixed-income retiree. My actual assets were elsewhere, invisible. The next morning I called in a favor from a man named Curtis Webb. We'd worked overlapping jurisdictions for 12 years. He ran a licensed private investigation firm out of a strip mall on Dickerson Pike and was the best investigative mind I'd encountered in 3 decades of police work. I told him I needed a full background workup on Daniel Marsh and Kayla Sutton. Employment, financial activity, any legal history. Everything public record would show, and everything adjacent to it. He called me 9 days later. I met him at a diner on Gallatin Road. He slid a manila envelope across the table without ceremony. Daniel hadn't held a job longer than 4 months in the past 3 years. His most recent employer had let him go for theft. Small amounts, never enough to trigger a formal charge, but enough to get walked to the door. His credit score placed him in a bracket that wouldn't qualify him for a secured card. He owed $11,000 to 3 different sources, 2 of them private individuals, who had been sending increasingly formal demand letters. Kayla had a cleaner surface record, but Curtis had found something else. She'd been listed as a witness on a disputed estate filing in Alabama 2 years ago. An elderly uncle of hers had left a modified will that had benefited Kayla significantly, and the modification had been challenged by other family members. The case had been settled out of court. The uncle had died 4 months after the will change, of natural causes, in an assisted living facility Kayla had helped select. I sat with that for a moment. Curtis watched me read. His expression was neutral. Pattern of behavior, he said quietly. Alabama was the rehearsal. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat and let the full weight of it settle. This was not impulse or desperation. This was methodology. Kayla had done this before, or something close enough. Daniel was either complicit or had been recruited precisely because of his relationship to me. Either way, it didn't change anything. It just completed the picture. They were in the kitchen when I got home, making dinner, an occurrence that had happened maybe 4 times in 8 months, and each time I'd noticed it coincided with a request for money in the following 24 hours. Kayla was at the stove and Daniel set down his phone quickly when I came through the door. Uncle Ray. He used the nickname he'd grown up using, the one that was supposed to feel like family. We thought we'd make your mother's pot roast tonight. Margaret's pot roast, actually. She'd taught him the recipe when he was 12 years old. He knew exactly what he was doing. I sat at my kitchen table and watched them move through the space my wife and I had built together, and I kept my face open and soft and a little tired, and I thought about the envelope in my car, and the evidence files I was building, and the trip I'd take tomorrow to Beverly Okafor's notary appointment to put her account into sworn testimony. Looks wonderful, I said. Thank you both. Over dinner, Daniel mentioned for the 3rd time in 2 weeks that the house felt like a lot for me to manage alone. He mentioned it the way a person mentions something they've been turning over for a while. Kayla was very quick with her agreement. There were these newer communities, she said, for active seniors. All the maintenance was handled. A person could really relax. I pushed the food around my plate and said I'd think about it. Their eyes met across the table. Quick and satisfied. 4 days later, I found the first brochure on the kitchen counter. Sunrise Ridge Senior Living. Full-service care. Memory support available. I left it where it was. The next day, there was another one tucked into the newspaper I kept by my reading chair. Then a 3rd one, folded between the mail. I photographed each one with my phone and added the images to my evidence files. Daniel escalated carefully. He brought up a doctor's appointment I'd forgotten, which I had legitimately forgotten, though for ordinary reasons. He mentioned it in front of Kayla in a tone that implied a pattern. He started finishing my sentences. He called me Pop on 2 occasions, a name he'd never used in 29 years, as if we'd always been closer than we were. The slow construction of a narrative, aging widower, living alone, beginning to decline, needs supervised care. I performed exactly the part they needed me to perform. I repeated questions I'd already asked. I left my reading glasses on the table and looked for them in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway one morning, as if I'd forgotten where I was going. Daniel watched me from the kitchen doorway, and I could see the satisfaction he was working to conceal. The following Tuesday, Grace called. "We've found something," she said. "Kayla went to the county clerk's office last week and requested information about changing property ownership documentation. The clerk she spoke to flagged the inquiry because the property she asked about matched one that had a legal hold placed through my office. The clerk noted her name and description. I had filed that legal hold the day after revising my will. A precautionary measure, Grace had suggested. "They're moving faster than I expected," I said. "They're getting nervous," Grace said. "The question is what they're going to do when they're nervous." I told her I had a strong suspicion. Curtis called me the next evening, short and direct, the way he always was. Your nephew's creditors have found his current address. At least one of them is showing up in person. You may want to be out of the house tomorrow afternoon." I thanked him and stayed exactly where I was. The man who came to my door the following afternoon was in his mid-40s, driving a late-model sedan with an out-of-state plate. Daniel answered the door before I could get there. I stood in the hallway and listened. The conversation was low and intense. Numbers were mentioned. A deadline at the end of the month. When the man left, Daniel stood at the closed door for a long moment before turning around and finding me in the hallway. His face went through 3 expressions in less than a second. "Who was that?" I asked. "Just somebody from work." Daniel's voice was steady. Nothing to worry about. He went upstairs. I went to my study and called Curtis to confirm what I'd just witnessed and add it to the documentation. That night, through the shared wall between my study and the guest room, I heard them arguing. I'd set my phone to record, the application running silently, the device placed close to the baseboard on my side. Their voices came through clearly enough. Kayla's was tighter, more controlled. Daniel's had a frantic edge. "We're almost out of time," she said. "Marcus isn't going to wait past the 31st. That's $11,000 we don't have. So we speed things up. The assessment center already gave me the name of a geriatric specialist. 1 evaluation. That's all it takes to start the competency process. Once we have medical documentation of cognitive decline, he'll fight it. He'll try." Kayla's voice went quieter, more precise. "But if there are 2 medical opinions and we have power of attorney already filed, it gets much harder for him to fight it. He's an old man living alone, Raymond. The courts move slowly. By the time he gets through an appeal, we'll have had access to everything for months." A pause. Then Daniel's voice, slower now, the way a man speaks when he's thinking about a line he hasn't crossed yet. "What if the assessment comes back clean?" Kayla didn't answer immediately. "There are other ways to manage things," she said finally. "People his age, accidents happen, stairs are dangerous. The house is old. There are things that look like natural causes when the right circumstances." I stopped recording. I had what I needed. I saved the file, encrypted it, backed it up to a cloud account they'd never have access to, and to a physical drive I locked in my car. Then I sat in my study for a long time, in the quiet house I'd shared with Margaret, and let the full understanding of it settle over me. My nephew's fiancée had just suggested killing me. Daniel hadn't said no. I didn't feel the rage the way I expected to. What I felt instead was something colder and much more focused. The thing that used to come over me at a crime scene when I understood for the first time exactly what had happened. The complete clarity of knowing. The mechanism of it engaging. The trap wasn't finished, but it was close. I spent the next 3 days being extremely, visibly confused. I asked Daniel twice what month it was. I left the front door unlocked on 2 occasions, just long enough for him to notice, and make a point of locking it and mentioning it to Kayla within my hearing. I declined to drive anywhere alone. I let my hands tremble slightly when I poured coffee. I asked Kayla the same question about her work schedule on 2 consecutive mornings, and watched the glance she exchanged with Daniel when I walked out of the room. Grace filed the fraud complaint with the district attorney's office on a Wednesday. Beverly Okafor had given her notarized testimony 2 days earlier, in person, without hesitation, her account clear and consistent and corroborated by the orderly's own statement, which Curtis had obtained through channels I preferred not to examine too closely. The bank froze my primary account that same afternoon, pending fraud investigation. Daniel's name had been added as an authorized user 3 days before I caught on, an authorization I had never signed, bearing a signature that was close to mine, but not close enough to survive examination by anyone who knew what they were looking at. I was in the backyard when Kayla's phone rang. She was on the kitchen phone, actually, and I'd left the back door open 3 inches. "What do you mean suspended?" Her voice was controlled, but the edges were starting to fray. "That account has funds? I saw the balance last week." "What kind of fraud hold? Who filed it?" Daniel appeared from somewhere inside, his voice joining hers in low and urgent conversation. I went back inside through the front door and sat in my reading chair and waited. They came to find me within 10 minutes. Kayla stood in the doorway of the living room. Her composure was intact, but something underneath it had shifted. "Uncle Ray, there seems to be a problem with your bank account. They're saying there's a fraud investigation. Is there?" I looked up from the book I was holding. Daniel stood behind her, His jaw was tight. Did you do something to the account? Did you talk to the bank? I called my attorney last week about some irregularities I'd noticed. I kept my voice mild and even. If the bank opened an investigation, that would be because of what she found. What irregularities? His voice went sharp. Someone added an authorized user to my account without my knowledge. Someone tried to access my property records at the county clerk's office. And someone at Mercy General used official letterhead in an attempt to manufacture a crisis in the middle of the night to get me to the hospital in a state of panic. The silence in my living room was complete. Then Daniel. You can't prove anything like that. I can. Evidence doesn't lie, Daniel. You know who taught me that? Your father. Frank used to say, Raymond, the truth is patient. It'll wait for you. Kayla tried a different approach. Her voice shifted into something warmer, more reasonable. Uncle Ray, we've been worried about you. You've been forgetting things. The door left unlocked. The questions. That's not normal for someone your age. We've only been trying to... Stop, I said. She stopped. I know about Alabama, I said. I know about Harold Sutton. I know about the assisted living facility, and the modified will, and the out-of-court settlement. Her face didn't change. That was the frightening part. She was better at this than Daniel. I also know what you said through the wall on Thursday night, I said. About stairs. About accidents. About things that look like natural causes. Daniel made a sound. Not quite a word. His face had gone the color of old paper. Everything I've described is documented, I said. Witness testimony, recorded conversations, financial records, the private investigator's report, the bank's own documentation of the fraudulent authorization. Grace Whitfield has copies of all of it. If either of you attempts to contact her office or interfere with anything she's filed, additional charges will be added. I've been a police officer for 31 years. I know exactly how this works. Kayla found her voice. You're making a terrible mistake. You're doing this out of spite because we expressed concern about your mental health. A judge will see two people who attempted elder financial fraud, who conspired to have an elderly relative declared incompetent for personal financial gain, and who had a recorded conversation about staging a fatal accident. I set my book down on the side table. You should call an attorney. I'd do it tonight. They went to their room. I could hear them through the wall for 2 hours, the sharp percussion of two people realizing simultaneously that their plan had collapsed around them. Grace called the next morning. The DA's office had accepted the case. Formal charges were being prepared. A warrant was issued for Kayla Sutton on 2 counts, fraud and conspiracy. Daniel Marsh was named as a co-defendant on the fraud count. They were to present themselves at the Criminal Justice Center by Friday morning. I was sitting on my back porch when they came to tell me they were leaving to consult with an attorney. Daniel paused in the doorway. He looked like his father for a moment, the way Frank used to look when he knew he'd done something he couldn't take back. That similarity hit me harder than I expected. It passed quickly. You didn't have to do this, he said. You chose to do this, I said. Every step of it. He went inside. I heard the front door close. Then I sat in the November quiet and looked out at the backyard Margaret had planted. The red maples she'd put in the corners were bare now, the leaves gone. She'd planted them as saplings. They were 40 feet tall. The preliminary hearing took place on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after that night at Mercy General. The courtroom was unremarkable. Institutional carpet, fluorescent light, the faint smell of coffee from somewhere down the hall. Kayla sat at the defense table in a blazer she'd bought specifically for this, I suspected. Her attorney was competent but clearly aware of the evidence he was working against. Daniel had retained a different attorney and had negotiated a separate arrangement through his counsel. He'd agreed to cooperate, to provide a full accounting of the scheme's planning, in exchange for reduced charges. His attorney had advised him well. The DA wanted Kayla. The judge was a man in his late 60s named Calloway, patient and deliberate, the kind of judge who reads every page of every filing. He reviewed the evidence inventory with visible attention, notarized witness testimony from Beverly Okafor, registered nurse, financial records showing unauthorized account access, the private investigator's report, 32 pages, the recording I'd made through the bedroom wall, transcribed and verified, the Alabama case history, obtained through legitimate discovery. Grace had built the case the way good cases are built, methodically, without gaps. Kayla Sutton was found guilty on both counts at the conclusion of trial 6 weeks later. Sentencing came in late March. Judge Calloway reviewed the pre-sentencing report and the victim impact statement I had provided. He was deliberate in the way he spoke, which I appreciated. Miss Sutton, the court has considered the full record of this case. What you engaged in was not a crime of desperation or impulse. This was a calculated, extended campaign to defraud an elderly man using manipulation, fabricated evidence, and ultimately a recorded discussion of physical harm. The court is particularly troubled by the documented pattern of similar behavior in Alabama, which suggests this is not an isolated incident but a practiced methodology. The court sentences you to 18 months in a correctional facility, to be followed by 3 years of supervised probation, a permanent no-contact order with the victim and his property, and restitution in the amount of $9,800 representing documented financial losses. Kayla's expression didn't change. I had watched a lot of people receive sentencing over the years. Some people go still when they hear it. She was one of those people. Daniel received 2 years of probation, a fine of $4,000, and a felony fraud conviction that would attach to his name for the rest of his life. He'd never work in banking or real estate or any licensed profession. The conviction would appear on every background check for every apartment he tried to rent, every job he applied for. The door it closed was very wide. He looked at me once when he walked out of the courtroom. He looked like he was trying to find something to say. I didn't give him the opportunity. I collected my things and walked out into the March morning. The eviction notice had been served 30 days before the trial concluded, legally precise, filed with the county. I'd been staying at a hotel on West End Avenue during the final weeks, having no particular desire to be in the house while they finished removing themselves from it. Grace had sent a property inspector. Her message said they'd taken their belongings, left the house keys on the kitchen table, no damage visible. I drove home on a Thursday afternoon and stood in my driveway for a moment before going inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for 8 months. The particular quiet that a house has when it belongs entirely to the person standing in it. I walked through the rooms. They'd taken what was theirs. What remained was mine. The furniture Margaret and I had chosen. The photographs on the hallway wall. The red maple saplings in the backyard that had grown into 40-foot trees. I had the locks changed that afternoon. A locksmith from a company I'd used before, a man named Terry, who'd been changing locks in Nashville for 20 years and never asked questions that weren't his business. He installed new deadbolts on both exterior doors, rekeyed the garage, reset the security panel, new codes that had never been in any of their hands. That evening I called Beverly Okafor. I'd spoken with her twice since the preliminary hearing, brief professional exchanges, but I wanted her to know how it had resolved. She answered on the third ring. The conviction came through, I said. She was quiet for a moment. 18 months? 18 months, plus probation and restitution, and a permanent record. Good, she said. And then, more quietly, you're all right? I'm all right. She told me something I hadn't known. After her testimony became part of the public record, the hospital administration had reviewed their employee access protocols. The orderly who'd allowed Kayla to use his credentials had resigned under pressure. The hospital had implemented a new visitor verification process, mandatory for anyone seeking access to patient areas outside regular visiting hours. A formal review of late-night administrative requests had been introduced. One incident, she said, and it changed how they run the whole department. Nobody else's family member is going to get a phone call like the one you got. I thanked her for what she'd done, for the hand on my arm in the lobby at 2 a.m, for the risk she'd taken on behalf of a stranger. I'm a nurse, she said simply. It's my job to keep people from getting hurt. I sat on my back porch for a long time after that call, watching the sun go down behind the property line. The financial accounting was finished. The $9,800 in court-ordered restitution had come through 2 weeks after sentencing. The bank had corrected the unauthorized account access and refunded the associated fees. My assets were fully intact, the new will properly recorded, the house secured. Kayla was serving her sentence at a facility in Middle Tennessee. I had no feelings about this that I could identify with precision, only the settled knowledge that the system I'd spent my adult life working within had functioned correctly. Daniel was somewhere in Nashville, living on whatever income, a convicted felon with no marketable skills and $4,000 in court fines could manage. I had heard through Curtis that he'd taken a job at a warehouse in Antioch. Third shift. I thought of Frank sometimes when I thought of Daniel, tried to separate them in my mind. Frank had been my brother and I had loved him. Daniel had made his choices independently, as an adult, with full understanding of what he was doing. Forgiveness is something people talk about as if it's a gift you give to someone else. In my experience, it's more personal than that. It doesn't require the other person's presence. I had come to a working peace with what had happened, not because they deserved peace, but because I had built a life worth protecting and I intended to go on living it. The evenings were what surprised me. I'd expected the house to feel empty in a bad way after they left. What I found instead was that it felt like mine again. I cooked the meals I wanted to cook. I left my books wherever I set them down. I called old colleagues and accepted invitations I'd been declining for 8 months, out of a vague sense that I couldn't leave the house unattended. I drove up to Radnor Lake on Saturday mornings and walked the trail Margaret had loved, the one that follows the water around the western end. The red-tailed hawks were back for the season. I stood on the observation deck and watched them for a long time. 31 years as a police officer teaches you many things. How to read a situation before you have enough information. How to hold still when everything in you wants to move. How to let a case build itself when you've laid the groundwork properly. How to recognize the moment when a predator has overcommitted and the only thing left is to close the trap. Daniel and Kayla had believed they were hunting a man who'd been weakened by age and grief and the isolation of living alone. They'd seen the house worth $590,000 and the retirement account and the fixed income, and they'd calculated a return on a modest investment of patience and performance. They'd been wrong about the man they were dealing with. The biggest mistake predators make is assuming that the absence of visible strength means the absence of strength. A retired police chief doesn't stop being a police chief. The skills don't retire. The knowledge doesn't retire. The patience doesn't retire. I'd sat at my kitchen table and watched them perform their concern and counted the evidence accumulating and waited for the moment they'd given me everything I needed. That moment had come at 2:14 in the morning in a hospital corridor when a nurse I'd never met closed her hand around my wrist and said, "Trust me and listen." I'd listened. The rest had proceeded exactly as it should. Standing at the kitchen window on a Friday evening in April, watching the light change on Margaret's maples, I felt the thing I'd been waiting to feel since that first night. Not triumph. Triumph is loud and temporary. What I felt was quieter than that. The restoration of a baseline. The world returned to its correct shape. My home, my peace, my name, all intact. They'd thought I was vulnerable because I was old. They'd thought I was easy because I was alone. They'd thought the love I'd had for Frank's memory would make me manageable. What that love had actually done was ensure that when I acted completely. I went to my study, sat down at my desk, and opened the book I'd been reading before all of this began. Picked up exactly where I'd left off. Outside, the last light of the day was going gold and long across the backyard. And Nashville was doing what cities do, going about its enormous and different business. And inside my house, it was quiet in the way that only your own house, fully your own, can be quiet. I turned the page. Before I let you go, if this story resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to Frost Vengeance and share your thoughts in the comments. It means more than you know. And if you want to hear the next story, it's waiting for you in the box just to the left. Thank you for being here.